Without having to watch 45's speech in front of us yesterday, we already knew that it was going to be pathetic. 45 uses inflammatory July 4th speech to distract from the actual coronavirus threat. As the nation marked a somber 4th of July with many Americans confined to their homes and an alarming rise in the coronavirus cases, 45 used his stage on the White House's South Lawn Saturday to put forward a mystifying and dangerously misleading claim that 99% of the coronavirus cases in America are totally harmless. Don't know where he came up with that number, but you know. The squatter's assertion without evidence about the virus was his latest attempt to minimize the threat of the coronavirus as it ravages the United States, with cases rising across the country, and as an increasing number of top Repug officials from the nation's governors to members of Congress pleaded with Americans to redouble their efforts to curb the spread of the virus, warning of the dangerous consequences if this current trend continues. Looking to distract the nation from the frightening spike in COVID-19 cases and America's grim death toll as it surpassed 129,000 people, 45 has plunged deeper into a racially charged strategy meant to bolster his support among white Americans who feel threatened by the cultural change sweeping America after the death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. To that end, he reprised many of the racially divisive lines from his speech at Mount Rushmore Friday night, where he claimed that a left-wing fascist mob is trying to end America by erasing the nation's history and indoctrinating its children, apparently hoping to top Friday night's inflammatory language. He compared his crusade to defeat the radical left to the efforts by the United States to eradicate the Nazis. Technically, people that support 45 are Nazis anyway, because they side a lot with them. The American heroes defeated the Nazis, dethroned the fascists, toppled the communists, saved American values, and upheld American principles and chased down the terrorists. To the very ends of the earth, 45 said Saturday evening at the White House. We are now in the process of defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters, and people who, in many instances, have absolutely no clue what they're doing. Technically, 45, you just described yourself, you got no fucking clue what you were doing. The squatter's speech was part of an event he hosted to celebrate July 4th by showcasing the pageantry and power of the U.S. military, while much of the nation had heeded the recommendations of 45 administration public health experts to avoid large gatherings. People had observed that there appeared to be little social distancing on the South Lawn, and many guests were not wearing masks. It was in that same speech that 45 made his latest puzzling claim about the virus, as he described the administration's flawed and lagging response to the pandemic as a great American success story, and he falsely suggested once again that the rise in cases in the U.S. is due to increased testing. Now we have tested almost 40 million people. By doing so, we show cases, 99% of which are totally harmless, results that no other country can show because no other country has testing that we have. Technically, they do, and their testing is better than ours. It is unclear how the squatter could be under the impression that 99% of the cases are totally harmless. There have now been at least 2.8 million cases of coronavirus in the United States, according to the latest data from the Johns Hopkins University, while the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that about 35% of the cases are asymptomatic. Those patients can still spread the virus. As of Saturday, Johns Hopkins estimated that the fatality rate for the U.S. was almost 5%. The White House has not returned CNN's request for comment on that squatter's claim. The Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration on Sunday declined to defend the squatter and repeatedly refused to say whether 45's remark was either true or false. I'm not going to get into who was right and who was wrong, said Dr. Stephen Hahn, a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. This is what he had told CNN's Dana Bash on State of the Union. With frontline medical workers in the audience, 45 also touted the nation's moves to manufacture more of the personal protective equipment and ventilators, that were so desperately needed at the beginning of the outbreak. He said the U.S. would likely have a therapeutic and/or vaccine solution long before the end of the year, probably not. He again blamed the spread of the coronavirus on China. China's secrecy, deceptions, and cover-up allowed the spread all over the world. 289 countries, and China must be held fully accountable, 45 said. China has repeatedly denied these claims, and 45 needs to be held responsible for his shitty response that he gave. The squatter's optimistic language about the coronavirus is very much at odds with the conditions on the ground in the nation's hotspots this weekend. States like Arizona, California, Florida, and Texas were still seeing record high numbers of cases last week, and hospitals in at least two Texas counties were at full capacity at the start of the holiday weekend, as the Lone Star State's county judges urged their residents to shelter in place. 45's refusal to confront the magnitude of the health crisis that America is facing has few parallels among other recent presidents in recent history have. Historian Douglas Brinkley noted on CNN Saturday evening that the President Woodrow Wilson attempted to minimize the Spanish flu pandemic because America was engaged in fighting a war, which was World War I at that time. But that effort by Wilson was nothing like what 45 was doing here, which is trying to turn 45 into his own private lionization of himself, Brinkley said, pointing to 45's recent visits to Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, his Klan rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and his Klan rally again in Arizona, not caring about social distancing and not wearing a mask. Can you imagine if Franklin Roosevelt in the middle of World War II did not invoke the spirit of World War II? Brinkley said in CNN's newsroom, describing Roosevelt's effort to bring Americans together in a time of a national crisis. At the very least, 45 should be given a hate speech on this Fourth, saying that basically at the very least 45 should be given a speech on this 4th of July, saying we have new heroes, the medical workers in America, the nurses, and the doctors and technicians that we now can be proud of, and someday there will be hospitals and memorials named after them. Instead, he didn't do that. Instead, he's just playing a game of swooping up monuments and memorials, Brinkley said, alluding to 45's obsession with defending what the squatter views as an assault on statues of Confederate generals and other key figures in American history with racist past. This has been a disappointing performance by 45. Senator Tammy Duckworth, an Illinois Democrat and possible vice president pick for the presumptive presidential nominee Joe Biden, said Sunday that 45 should focus more on the pandemic and reports that Russia offered bounties to Taliban fighters to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Instead, he spent more time worried about honoring dead Confederates than he did talking about the 130,000 Americans who lost their lives due to the COVID-19, or by warning Russia off by the bounty they're putting on American heads, said Duckworth and CNN's State of the Union. This is why his priorities are wrong. The squatter's appearance at Friday's event in South Dakota, which had no social distancing and very little mask wearing, and at his 4th of July party in Washington D.C., where a few of his guests chose to wear masks, came at a time when some of his closest allies are urging him to take a greater leadership and encouraging facial coverings, in which he won't do, and other measures that would curb the spread of the virus. 45 has held out on masks as a long list of GOP leaders, including Senate Majority Leader Moscow Mitch and House Republican Leader Kevin McCarthy, as well as his own Surgeon General and public health officials, have pleaded with the public to wear face coverings. In the abrupt reversal Thursday, Texas Repub Governor Greg Abbott made face coverings mandatory for most residents across the Lone Star State. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, another fucking idiot, another 45 ally, wore a mask at a number of events last week, including with the Vice President Dumbass Pence, who has walked a careful line himself, wearing one of numerous recent public appearances, while saying the decision should be up to local officials and individuals. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp also toured his state last week, urging the residents of Georgia to wear masks, and even 45 boosters like Steve Ducey, a co-host of Foe and Friends, said this week that if the squatter wore a mask, it would set a good example and he'd be a good role model. Technically, he wouldn't. He's still not a good role model anyway, even with wearing a mask. Ducey noted that his friends in New Jersey and New York wear masks all the time and keep telling him that if the squatter wore a mask, it will make him look as if he's taking it seriously and is listening to the CDC, which he doesn't take anything seriously anyway. So, meanwhile, Austin, Texas Mayor Steve Adler, a Democrat, said Sunday that 45's actions are dangerous. It makes me angry, Adler told Bash. It is dangerous not to be sending a clear message to Americans and to folks in any town. When they start hearing that kind of ambiguous message coming out of Washington, there are more and more people that won't wear a mask, that won't social distance, that won't do what it takes to keep a community safe, he said, adding that he would like Abbott, a Repug, to give local authorities the ability to issue any stay-at-home orders. But 45 did not heed the advice at either his event this weekend, allowing his 4th of July spectacular to play out like any other year. But in Washington, D.C., at least many of the usual spectators who would turn out for the display of military might and fireworks did not this year. The crowds were sparse, a sign of that many Americans are now paying more attention to the guidance of medical experts than to the example of the squatter.